The raft lurched sideways as white water exploded over the logs, and for a moment, all 12 men aboard believed they were going to die. The contraption beneath them, lashed together with rope in a pattern no experienced riverman would ever use, flexed and twisted like a living thing as the Yellowstone River tried to tear it apart. Behind them, other trappers had called it the Fool's Raft, a suicide machine that would break up in the first serious rapid and send everyone to a cold grave. But here they were, halfway through the most dangerous water in the territory, and the impossible raft was still holding together. Before we get into this, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories about frontier innovation and survival against the odds, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1839, and the Rocky Mountain fur trade was still profitable for men willing to risk everything. Beaver pelts commanded good prices in eastern markets, though not as high as a decade earlier. The window for making real money was closing, but for trappers who worked hard and survived the dangers, a successful season could still change a life. The risks were substantial. Grizzly bears, territorial conflicts, accidents, and brutal winters killed men regularly. But the greatest danger for many trappers wasn't the wilderness itself. It was getting their pelts to market before prices dropped or competitors flooded the trading posts. Ezra Colton understood these realities better than most. He was 31 years old in the spring of 1839, with 8 seasons of mountain trapping behind him. He had come west from Pennsylvania in 1831, part of the last major wave of young men seeking fortune in beaver fur. Unlike many who died in their first winter or gave up after a hard season, Ezra had learned to read the mountains, understand the rivers, and survive through careful planning rather than reckless bravery. He was known among other trappers as competent and reliable, which in the mountain trade was higher praise than being called fearless or lucky. That winter, Ezra had partnered with 11 other trappers working the tributaries of the Yellowstone River in what would later become Montana Territory. The group was informal, not a formal company, just men who had agreed to work the same area and combine resources for mutual benefit. By early April, they had accumulated nearly 2,000 beaver pelts, along with otter, mink, and a few valuable fox pelts. It was the best collective haul any of them had ever achieved. The problem emerged as the snow began melting. Spring runoff in the Rockies is dramatic and unpredictable. In 1839, the snowpack had been exceptionally heavy. When warm weather arrived in mid-April, the melt was sudden and intense. Within a week, every waterway in the region was running at flood stage. The Yellowstone River, normally navigable by experienced raftsmen during spring, became something entirely different. The water was 3 to 4 feet higher than anyone in the group had seen before. The current was violent. Rapids that were challenging in normal years became impassable. Looking at the swollen river, every man in Ezra's group agreed that rafting was impossible that spring. The water was too fast, too high, too dangerous. The pelts needed to reach the trading post at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, roughly 120 miles downstream from their camp. The standard method was to build rafts and float the pelts down. It was faster than overland travel, less physically demanding, and allowed transporting much more weight. Every trapper in the region used river transport when possible. Traditional raft construction followed patterns that had been proven over decades of frontier use. Men would select logs of uniform size, typically pine or spruce, between 10 and 14 inches in diameter. These logs would be laid parallel, notched at the ends, and bound together with crosspieces using rope or rawhide in a simple grid pattern. The goal was creating a rigid platform that would float high on the water and remain stable in moderate current. The problem was that these traditional rafts required specific water conditions to work safely. The river needed to be high enough to float the loaded raft over rocks and shallow sections, but not so high that the current became unmanageable. Rapids needed to be readable, with clear channels and predictable hydraulics. Most importantly, the raft needed to stay rigid. Any flexing or twisting of the log platform would cause the lashing to fail, the logs to separate, and the entire structure to break apart. Experienced rivermen knew these limitations intimately. They had seen rafts come apart in bad conditions. Some had survived such disasters, Others had watched men drown when rafts failed in fast water. Looking at the Yellowstone in mid-April of 1839, every experienced man in Ezra's group recognized that the river violated every condition necessary for safe rafting. The water was too high, the current too fast, the rapids too violent. Attempting to run that river on a traditional raft would result in certain destruction. The rigid construction that worked in normal conditions would shatter under the extreme forces of floodwater. The alternative was overland transport, but this presented serious problems. The group didn't have enough horses for 2,000 pelts. Multiple trips would take weeks. The trails were muddy and dangerous. Most critically, time mattered. Other trapping groups had good seasons. If everyone arrived at the trading post simultaneously, prices would drop significantly. The first arrivals would get premium prices. Those coming late might barely break even. The 12 men spent 3 days debating options. Some argued for waiting until the water dropped, even if it meant arriving late and accepting lower prices. Others wanted to risk the overland route despite the difficulties. A few suggested splitting up. Every option had serious drawbacks. Waiting meant losing money. Overland travel meant exhausting work with high risk. Splitting up meant dividing their strength. While the others argued, Ezra spent most of those 3 days walking along the riverbank, watching the water, studying how it moved. He was looking at something the others weren't seeing. He noticed patterns in how debris moved through the rapids. He observed which types of logs rode the current successfully and which ones got caught or destroyed. He paid attention to the rhythm of the waves, the behavior of the eddies, the way force distributed across different surfaces. And slowly, an idea formed that contradicted everything experienced rivermen knew about raft construction. On the evening of the third day, Ezra gathered the 11 men around the campfire and explained his plan. He would build a raft, but not the kind any of them had ever seen. Instead of uniform logs bound rigidly together, he would use logs of different sizes and densities arranged in layers. Instead of simple grid lashing designed to prevent movement, he would use a complex basket weave rope pattern that allowed controlled flexing. The raft would ride low in the water rather than high. It would bend with the current rather than fight against it. To men who had spent years learning traditional raft construction, everything Ezra described sounded like madness. The objections came immediately. James Wheeler, the oldest man in the group at 43 with 15 seasons of mountain experience, spoke first. A raft that flexed would tear itself apart. The lashing would fail. The logs would separate. Everyone would drown. That was basic riverman knowledge, proven by decades of experience. Michael Chen, who had worked as a boatman on the Ohio River before coming west, agreed. Low-riding rafts swamped in rough water. You needed buoyancy and height to ride over waves. Ezra's design would sink or flip in the first rapid. Thomas Running Deer, a Delaware man who had trapped with French-Canadian voyageurs and learned their river techniques, said the basket weave lashing was unnecessarily complicated and would take too long to construct properly. They needed to move quickly, not waste weeks on experimental construction. Ezra listened to every objection without arguing. Then he asked a simple question. Had any of them ever run water this violent on a traditional raft? The answer was no. Traditional rafts weren't built for these conditions. That was precisely why everyone agreed the river was impassable. But Ezra had been watching how the river treated different objects. Rigid things broke. Flexible things survived. Large trees snapped when they hit rocks. Smaller branches bent and rode over obstacles. The river wasn't one consistent force. It was thousands of separate forces hitting from different directions simultaneously. A rigid raft would fight all those forces at once and eventually lose. A flexible raft would absorb and distribute the forces continuously. The group split immediately. 4 men thought Ezra was probably right, but weren't willing to risk their lives testing the theory. They would take their share of pelts overland. 3 men thought Ezra was absolutely wrong, but respected him enough to wait and watch before deciding. 4 men, desperate enough or confident enough in Ezra's judgment, committed immediately to attempting the river if he could build what he described. Ezra himself was committed regardless of whether anyone joined him. He had done the mathematics in his head. Overland travel meant arriving 3 weeks late, minimum. Late arrival meant prices would drop by half or more. Half price meant the entire season barely covered costs. He would rather risk the river and potentially die than survive and waste a year of brutal work for nothing. The next morning, Ezra began selecting logs. The other men watched with a mixture of curiosity, doubt, and concern. What he was building looked nothing like a proper raft. Ezra spent the first day selecting timber with a precision that seemed obsessive to the watching men. He rejected dozens of perfectly good logs that would have worked fine in traditional construction. He was looking for specific characteristics that matched his mental blueprint. For the bottom layer, he wanted dense hardwoods, green cottonwood, and willow that would sink slightly and ride low in the water. For the upper layers, he selected lighter pine and spruce that would provide buoyancy, but not so much that the raft rode high and caught wind or waves. He chose logs of different diameters deliberately, ranging from 8 inches to 16 inches, creating an uneven surface that looked chaotic but served a specific purpose. The lashing technique was where Ezra's design truly departed from convention. Traditional rafts used simple perpendicular lashing, ropes crossing at 90-degree angles to hold logs in place. Ezra used a diagonal basket weave pattern he had seen native women use for burden baskets. The rope crossed each log at 45-degree angles, wrapping under and over in a continuous spiral that connected every log to every other log through multiple connection points. This pattern created something unexpected. Individual logs could shift slightly in response to localized force, but the overall structure remained connected because no single rope bore all the stress. If one section of lashing stretched or loosened, the surrounding weave compensated automatically. He spent 3 full days just on the lashing work, using nearly 200 feet of rope in patterns that seemed wasteful to experienced raftsmen. But Ezra was thinking about physics that most men understood only intuitively. Force applied to a rigid structure concentrates at the weakest points until those points fail catastrophically. Force applied to a flexible structure distributes across multiple points simultaneously, with each point bearing only a fraction of the total stress. The basket weave pattern meant that when a wave hit the raft from one direction, the force spread through the rope network to every log on the structure. No single connection point ever bore more than a small percentage of the total impact. The layered construction served multiple purposes. The heavy bottom logs kept the center of gravity low, making the raft nearly impossible to flip. The lighter upper logs provided enough buoyancy to keep the platform from sinking completely. The mixed diameters created gaps between logs where water could flow through rather than building up pressure against a solid surface. Traditional rafts fought the water, creating resistance that the river eventually overcame. Ezra's raft would let water pass through it continuously, reducing the total force the structure needed to withstand. He built handholds into the design by leaving rope loops at regular intervals where men could grip if the ride got violent. He created a slightly raised center section where pelts could be stacked and stay relatively dry, even if the outer edges rode underwater. By the 6th day, the raft was complete. It measured roughly 12 feet wide by 20 feet long, large enough to carry the pelts and 12 men, but small enough to maneuver in tight channels. Looking at it, half the men saw genius. The other half saw a death trap. The raft sat at the water's edge, an odd-looking contraption that inspired no confidence in men accustomed to traditional construction. Ezra announced he would test it alone on a short run through the nearest rapids, about 2 miles downstream where the river narrowed and the current accelerated over a rocky bed. It wasn't the most dangerous section they would eventually face, but it was violent enough to prove whether the design worked or failed catastrophically. He loaded 200 pounds of rocks onto the center platform to simulate the weight of pelts and men, took one of the long poles they had cut for steering, and pushed off into the current alone. The 11 men walked along the bank, following the raft's progress. What they saw contradicted everything they thought they knew about rivercraft. The raft rode low, water washing continuously over the logs, sometimes submerging the entire front section before bobbing back up. It twisted and flexed as it hit waves, the logs shifting independently but never separating. When it struck a partially submerged boulder, instead of splintering or stopping, the flexible construction allowed the impact point to give while the rest of the raft flowed around the obstacle. Ezra used the pole not to fight the current, but to make small corrections, working with the river's force rather than against it. 20 minutes later, he guided the raft into calm water below the rapids, the structure intact, the rocks still secured to the platform. He walked back upstream and found the men arguing. The test run had been impressive, but the rapids Ezra had just navigated were minor compared to what lay downstream. The truly dangerous sections were 15 to 20 miles into the journey, where the river dropped elevation rapidly through a canyon with no possibility of portaging around. If the raft failed there, everyone aboard would die. No one could swim in that water. There would be no rescue, no second chances. 4 men remained absolutely opposed to attempting the journey. They would take their pelts overland regardless of the delay. 3 men were now cautiously optimistic, but still undecided. 4 men were fully committed to trying the river. The financial pressure made the decision harder. They calculated the economics repeatedly. Overland travel meant arriving at least 20 days after the first trappers from other regions. Late arrival historically meant prices dropped by 40 to 60%. River travel, if it worked, would get them there in 3 to 4 days, ahead of everyone else, commanding premium prices. The difference represented the entire profit margin for the season. Arriving late meant barely breaking even after a year of dangerous work. Arriving early meant potentially doubling their money, but arriving dead meant leaving families without support and bodies that might never be found. They voted the next morning. 8 men chose the river, 4 chose overland. The group divided their pelts accordingly. Ezra began loading the raft with the 8 men's shares, roughly 1,600 pelts bundled and secured to the platform. With 8 men plus Ezra making 9, plus 3 men who finally decided to risk it after watching the loading process, they would be 12 aboard. The next morning, they would launch into water that veterans said was impassable. They launched at dawn when the water was calmest, though calm was relative on a river running at flood stage. The 12 men positioned themselves according to Ezra's instructions, 4 men in front with poles for steering and pushing off obstacles, 4 men in the middle gripping the rope handholds and managing the pelt bundles, 4 men in back with additional poles for control. Ezra stood front right, the primary navigator. The moment they pushed off from shore, the current grabbed the raft and accelerated it downstream faster than any of them had anticipated. There was no turning back now. The river owned them completely. The first thing every man noticed was how different this felt from any watercraft they had experienced. The raft rode low, water constantly washing over their feet and legs, sometimes waist-deep when waves hit. Traditional rafts stayed mostly dry. This one was perpetually half-submerged. The second difference was the movement. The logs shifted and flexed beneath them continuously, creating a sensation like standing on something alive. Men accustomed to rigid platforms found this deeply unsettling initially. But as they entered the first rapid, the wisdom of the design became apparent. The raft didn't fight the water's chaos, it moved with it. The first rapid was moderate, a 50-yard stretch where the river dropped 4 feet over jumbled rocks. On a traditional raft, this would require careful navigation to avoid hitting obstacles directly. Ezra's approach was different. He didn't try to dodge every rock. He let the flexible construction absorb impacts, using his pole only to prevent the raft from turning sideways or getting pinned against larger obstacles. When the front left section struck a boulder, those logs compressed slightly while the rest of the raft flowed around. The basket weave lashing distributed the impact force across the entire structure. They rode through with nothing more than jarring bumps. The men began to understand. This wasn't about avoiding force. It was about managing force. Over the next 2 hours, they navigated 6 more rapids of increasing difficulty. Each time, the pattern repeated. The raft would twist, flex, partially submerge, and emerge intact on the other side. The pole work required was minimal compared to traditional rafting. Ezra called out occasional commands, but mostly the men just held on and trusted the construction. The pelt bundles stayed secured. No one fell off. The structure showed no signs of the lashing failing or logs working loose. By midday, they had covered 15 miles, more than twice what experienced raftsmen would have predicted possible in these conditions. The men were soaked, exhausted from maintaining balance on the shifting platform, but increasingly confident. Then they heard it, a deep, continuous roar ahead that could only mean one thing. They were approaching the canyon section. the truly dangerous water that would either prove Ezra's design revolutionary or prove the skeptics right. The 4 men who had chosen the overland route were probably 10 miles behind them, walking through mud. The 12 men on the raft gripped their handholds tighter and prepared for what came next. The canyon appeared gradually, the riverbanks rising from gentle slopes to vertical rock walls over the course of a mile. The roar grew louder until conversation became impossible. Ezra pointed ahead, and the men saw what they were entering, a quarter-mile stretch of continuous whitewater where the river dropped nearly 30 feet through a narrow channel studded with boulders. There was no calm water visible, no clear path, just chaos. Several men gripped the rope handholds so tightly their knuckles went white. This was the section that killed people. This was why experienced rivermen had said the river was impassable. They hit the first major drop, doing what felt like 20 miles per hour. The front of the raft dove underwater completely, submerging the 4 forward men to their chests before the buoyancy brought it back up. Immediately, a wave from the left struck broadside, twisting the entire structure 30 degrees. The basket weave lashing stretched and groaned, but held. Ezra jammed his pole against a rock on the right, not to stop the spin but to control it, keeping them from turning completely sideways. A sideways raft would catch the current wrong and flip or pin against the canyon wall. They needed to stay roughly aligned with the flow. What happened over the next 8 minutes was less like navigation and more like controlled chaos. The raft hit obstacles continuously. Rocks, standing waves, hydraulics that tried to suck the platform underwater. Each impact caused different sections of the raft to compress, twist, or flex independently. The logs moved so much that men could feel them shifting beneath their feet, but the overall structure never separated. The force of each impact spread through the rope network to every connection point. When the front right corner hit a boulder hard enough to stop a quasi, traditional raft dead, the flexible construction allowed that section to absorb the impact while the rest of the raft swung around, using the boulder as a pivot point. Ezra's pole work was constant but subtle. He wasn't fighting the river. He was making micro-adjustments that prevented catastrophic angles or positions. When the current tried to push them toward the canyon wall where they could get pinned and crushed, he used a rock outcrop to push off, redirecting their momentum back toward center channel. When a hole tried to capture the raft in recirculating water, he read it a second before they hit and shifted their angle just enough that they rode over instead of into it. The other men with poles followed his lead, learning through desperate necessity how to work with the design rather than against the chaos. Halfway through, a massive standing wave hit them head-on. Water crashed over the entire raft, a green wall that submerged everything and everyone for 3 full seconds. Men held their breath and gripped the rope loops with everything they had. When the raft emerged on the other side, all 12 men were still aboard, the pelts still secured, the structure intact. Then the roar changed pitch. Ahead, through the spray, they saw something that made even Ezra's expression change. The river disappeared over what looked like a horizon line. They were approaching a waterfall. There was no time to scout, no possibility of portaging around with the loaded raft. The current was too strong, the canyon walls too steep. They were committed. Ezra recognized what they were facing in the seconds before they reached it. Not a true vertical waterfall, but a near vertical drop, perhaps 8 to 10 feet, where the river poured over a rock ledge into a turbulent pool below. Traditional rafts would hit the bottom flat, breaking apart from the impact. Rigid construction couldn't survive that kind of sudden deceleration. But Ezra's design wasn't rigid. He made a split second, a decision that seemed insane but was the only option that made sense. He shouted one word that most of the men couldn't hear over the roar but understood from his gesture. Hold. Then the front of the raft went over the edge. What happened next occurred too fast for conscious thought, but slow enough that every man would remember each moment with perfect clarity for the rest of his life. The front logs tipped downward into the drop, while the back logs were still on the upper level, creating an angle that should have torn the raft apart. The basket weave lashing stretched to its absolute limit. Individual ropes went bar tight, but the distributed load meant no single connection bore enough force to snap. The front hit the pool below with tremendous impact, driving those logs underwater while the back of the raft was still airborne. For a moment, the structure was nearly vertical, standing on end in a configuration that defied everything about how rafts should behave. Then, physics took over. The buoyancy of the submerged front logs fought to rise, while the weight of the back logs pulled downward. The flexible construction allowed the raft to fold in the middle, absorbing the conflicting forces by bending rather than breaking. It folded nearly in half, like a book closing, then rebounded as the back section hit the water. Men tumbled forward, but didn't fall off because they were gripping the rope loops. Pelt bundles shifted but stayed secured because Ezra had lashed them using the same basket weave pattern as the raft itself. Water exploded over everything, and for 3 seconds no one could see anything but white foam. The raft spun a complete circle in the turbulent pool, the current catching it and throwing it sideways. One corner struck a rock hard enough that the impact reverberated through every log. Then they were through, spat out of the pool into fast but calmer water downstream. Ezra did a quick visual inspection while the other men caught their breath and checked themselves for injuries. Every man was still aboard. Several were bleeding from minor cuts. One man had a bruised shoulder from being thrown against the pelt bundles, but no one was seriously hurt. More importantly, the raft itself was intact. The lashing had stretched but hadn't failed. A few ropes had frayed where they'd rubbed against rocks, but the redundancy in the pattern meant those individual damage points didn't compromise the overall structure. They had survived what should have been impossible. But the journey wasn't over yet. The river calmed gradually over the next hour as the canyon walls receded and the channel widened. The men remained tense, expecting another catastrophic rapid, but the worst was behind them. By late afternoon, they were floating through rolling hills where the current was strong but manageable. The raft had held together through forces that would have destroyed traditional construction. The flexible design had proven itself not through theory, but through survival. Every man aboard was soaked, exhausted, and amazed to be alive. They had navigated water that experienced rivermen had declared impassable, and they had done it on a raft those same experts had called suicidal. They reached the trading post at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers 3 days after launching. The post consisted of several log buildings surrounded by a palisade, serving as the primary market for trappers working the upper Yellowstone region. When they guided the raft to shore, the men working the docks stopped and stared. They recognized several members of Ezra's group and knew where they had come from. They also knew the Yellowstone had been running at record flood stage. No one should have been able to navigate that water. Yet here were 12 men arriving with a full season's worth of pelts, days ahead of when overland travelers would arrive. Word spread quickly. By evening, every trapper and trader at the post had heard about the Seine, fool's raft that survived the impossible run. Men came to examine the construction, walking around the beached raft with expressions ranging from disbelief to careful analysis. Some remained skeptical, suggesting Ezra's group had simply gotten lucky. Others recognized immediately that they were looking at a genuine innovation. The flexible lashing pattern was studied and discussed. Several experienced raftsmen admitted they had never seen anything like it, but couldn't argue with the results. The raft had brought 12 men through water that should have killed them. The economic outcome exceeded even optimistic predictions. Because they arrived first, days before the rush of other trappers, they sold their pelts at premium prices. The trading post factor was eager to buy everything they had, knowing he could resell at significant markup before supply flooded the market. Each man made roughly 80% more than they would have if they had arrived later with the overland groups. For most, it represented the best season they had ever had. For some, it was enough money to retire from trapping entirely and start new lives in settlements or farming communities. The 4 men who had chosen overland travel arrived 19 days later, exhausted from the journey and disappointed to learn they had missed premium prices by more than 2 weeks. When they saw Ezra's group relaxing at the post, already having sold their pelts and made their profit, the contrast was stark. The men who had risked the river were wealthy. The men who had chosen safety were barely breaking even. That evening, as traders and trappers gathered around fires, the story of the fool's raft was told and retold. What had started as a desperate gamble was becoming legend. The story of Ezra Colton's raft spread through the mountain trade network over the following months. Trappers arriving at rendezvous points and trading posts heard variations of the tale, some accurate, some embellished, all emphasizing the same core facts. A man had built a raft using unconventional methods. He had navigated water that experienced rivermen declared impassable. He had brought 12 men through alive when conventional wisdom predicted certain death. The design details traveled with the story. Trappers who had examined the raft at the trading post described the basket weave lashing pattern, the mixed log sizes, the flexible construction philosophy to others who listened carefully and took mental notes. By 1841, modified versions of Ezra's design were appearing on rivers throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Not every trapper understood or successfully replicated the engineering principles, but enough understood the core concept that flexible construction could survive forces that destroyed rigid structures. The basket weave lashing technique in particular spread widely because it solved problems beyond just whitewater navigation. Rafts built using that pattern lasted longer in general use, held together better under stress, and required less frequent repair. Several documented accounts from the early 1840s specifically mentioned trappers using what they called Colton-style lashing or flexible rafts when describing their river transport methods. The lives saved by this innovation are impossible to count, precisely because survival often goes unrecorded. But scattered references in journals, letters, and trading post records indicate multiple instances where men navigated dangerous water successfully using flexible raft designs. They specifically attributed to hearing about Ezra's technique. One particularly detailed account from 1843 describes a group of 7 trappers surviving a flash flood on the Snake River because their raft, built using diagonal rope patterns and mixed log sizes, held together when a traditional raft would have broken apart. The writer explicitly credits learning the construction method from trappers who had seen Ezra's original raft. Ezra himself left the mountains in 1844 when the fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped out in many areas, and changing fashion in the east had reduced demand for pelts. He used the money from his successful seasons to purchase land in the Willamette Valley of Oregon Territory, married in 1845, and lived quietly as a farmer for the next 32 years. He rarely spoke about his trapping days and never promoted his raft design. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a farmer who had once worked in the mountains like thousands of other men. He died in 1876 at age 68 and was buried in a small cemetery outside Oregon City. His gravestone made no mention of rafts or rivers, but the principle he had proven remained valid long after his death. Sometimes the solution that experts call foolish is the only one that works. Sometimes surviving the impossible requires abandoning conventional wisdom and trusting physics over tradition. Ezra Colton built something that shouldn't have worked. According to experienced rivermen, he proved them wrong not through argument, but through survival, and in doing so, he changed how men thought about navigating dangerous water on the American frontier.